In our last few lessons, we looked at how some basic psychological principles apply to music. Now I want to focus on another basic notion of musical composition of a different sort, musical craftsmanship. Craftsmanship is often misunderstood. Seen in the narrowest way, craftsmanship is seen as knowing a lot of recipes to make music sound like classical repertoire. But while style study can be interesting in a musicological sense, for the composer, it's only of limited value. The real goals of training in musical craftsmanship are two: fluency and knowing what to demand of yourself. Normally, a composer's training includes harmony, counterpoint, and orchestration, and then composing smaller works followed by larger ones. Let's talk about each of these stages individually. Harmony is normally taught as classical tonal harmony, which then goes on to chromatic harmony, and perhaps also into various 20th century techniques. Classical tonal harmony is indeed a good place to start, since there's so much wonderful existing music that's based on it. It's a very coherent musical language, characterized by efficient voice leading, refined dissonance treatment, many degrees of hierarchical punctuation, and a strong sense of direction. So learning to use it really well implies mastering these things, organized in a pedagogically reasonable way. This requires lots of practice. Quantity counts. Just as in learning a language, 1 hour a week won't make you fluent. Now, if you go through a good course in classical harmony, doing lots of exercises, you'll eventually become fluent in its usage. But even more importantly, if it's well taught, it should make you much more sensitive to all of the above things: voice leading, levels of dissonance, punctuation, and direction. And critically, these are musical requirements not limited to the classical style. Let's see how they can be generalized. Efficient voice leading implies that, in any non-monophonic music, individual parts don't move in random ways, but make oral sense and are relatively easy to sing or play. Any musical language with no sensitivity to degrees of dissonance and harmonic tension ends up sounding gray and monotonous, or else just random. Similarly, music with no hierarchy of punctuation makes longer forms very hard to sustain convincingly, since the listener has no way of knowing where they are in the piece. Music with no sense of direction is also hard to make engaging for the listener over longer spans of time. Now let's talk about counterpoint. Counterpoint and harmony are not separate in real life. Counterpoint without harmonic coherence sounds random, and harmony, without some attention to the individual lines making up the whole, is boring for the performers. Counterpoint is, in a sense, the other side of harmony. Whereas in harmony we focus on chords and chord progressions, in counterpoint we're adding an additional requirement: interesting lines for everybody. In a good counterpoint course, the student learns the many ways lines can interact with each other while still keeping the whole texture coherent. It's easy to write multiple simultaneous interesting lines that are harmonically incoherent, or that are constantly distracting from one another. The real challenge lies in distributing the interest more or less evenly among all the lines, in ways that allow each line to emerge from the others at some point, and that also respect the general requirements of good harmony, as outlined above. Once again, this conception of counterpoint isn't limited to classical style. It's just as relevant in other harmonic worlds. Too often, students assume that in less traditional harmonic language, anything goes. This is wrong, since our musical brains are not blank slates. Rather, human perception imposes definite limits on what can make oral sense, as we have seen in our previous lessons. Before going on to the next stages of the composer's education, I want to say a word about ear training. Although ear training is normally considered prerequisite for the other subjects mentioned above, it should continue at the same time as an integral part of them. The way Nadia Boulanger taught, requiring students to be able to play and sing all their harmony and counterpoint exercises, should be the norm. There's simply no point in doing written exercises if you can't hear them in detail. And the best way to make sure you really hear what's going on is to sing each line while playing the others. This takes a lot more time than just writing dots on paper, but for serious musical training it's absolutely essential. Properly approached, harmony and counterpoint are ear training, not just abstract lists of rules. Counterpoint normally culminates with the study of fugue. Fugue is where counterpoint becomes real composition. The student has to write a whole piece using limited thematic material. The form has to make sense as a whole, always developing the material. But it also has to breathe in the episodes. And then, finally, it needs to arrive at a climax of intensity. These are compositional requirements that go well beyond simple counterpoint. Orchestration adds another rich dimension to the student's world. Harmony and counterpoint are normally first taught using homogeneous ensembles like choir or string orchestra. But this is a pedagogical limitation, just to keep things simple at the start of these already quite complicated subjects. Eventually, however, a composer wanted to explore the richness provided by variety of timbre. This brings us to the fundamental notion behind orchestration, planes of tone. Orchestration is all about what blends and what does not, and how to combine planes of tone in coherent ways. Again, it's not hard to compose for orchestra and to give everybody elaborate parts. The challenge is not to have it sound totally chaotic, like a mass of people playing at random. And that requires constant attention to orchestral hierarchy. What will emerge in a given passage? What will be background? What will provide a sense of movement? Does the orchestration support and emphasize the continuities and contrasts of the musical form, or does it weaken them? The last part of a composer's education in the craft of musical composition normally consists of writing small pieces in familiar classical forms, like a minuet, a rondo, or a sonata. These exercises usually start with these familiar forms, but eventually must go farther. As with harmony and counterpoint, the idea here is not that we should be blindly using these familiar structures as formulas. The real point is that they embody certain basic principles that are necessary when developing the composer's own sense of form. First, an idea is presented and worked out for a while. Then, if the work is of any length, it'll need some kind of contrast to renew interest. It also will require a sense that the music breathes. Sometimes the music needs to intensify, at other times to relax. And then, there's often some kind of rounding off, returning to familiar ground in order to end more convincingly. The organization of the most intense points in the piece, the climaxes, is also an essential part of the sense of form, as are clear notions about what makes a good beginning, a satisfactory ending, and whether the work's proportions make sense, and so on. As with harmony and counterpoint, the sense of form is not an intellectual exercise, but a set of very practical skills. It's learning by doing. Finally, all of these aspects of musical craft need to be integrated into the composer's own voice, creating a recognizable personal sound. A real composer eventually comes to have clear preferences in harmony, counterpoint, and orchestration. The interaction of these preferences can create a sound of one's own. Ultimately, craftsmanship comes down to what we ask of ourselves. The higher the level of your craft, the more you'll demand of yourself in your work. The greatest artists have never been satisfied with just acceptable work. They're aiming at the absolute best they can do and always improving. This attitude to musical craft over time, combined with gradually developing your own voice, is what makes for a real, mature composer.